Another major group are Puerto Ricans. Puerto Ricans had been migrating to the United States well before the Spanish-American War in 1898. Various groups, one of the first groups were merchants in the 1830s, and so you see merchant organizations in the 1830s before the Civil War in places like Philadelphia and New York. These are largely sugar merchants who are setting up communities there and kind of facilitating trade between New York, Philadelphia, and the island of Puerto Rico. We also tend to have political exiles. One of the things that Spain did, Spain of course controls Puerto Rico and Cuba up until 1898. Those who are advocating independence from Spain, Spain's response to that was often political exile. And so rather than put them in jail for extended periods, rather than execute folks outright, they tended to send them into political exile. So you have these political activists who are in places like Tampa, in places like Miami, New York, and Philadelphia, who are then advocating for political independence from Spain and for Puerto Rico and Cuba. And so you have then this kind of a network there in places like New York City. After 1898, once then Puerto Rico becomes a part of the United States, migration to the U.S. Increases steadily. One of the things facilitating this, new immigration was the Jones Act of 1917. The Jones Act then confers U.S. citizenship to all Puerto Ricans. So after 1917, all Puerto Ricans are American citizens. And that's an important aspect, right, in terms of the migration. There are no kind of citizenship issues, visa issues, passport, and so on for the movement of Puerto Ricans back and forth between the mainland and the U.S. I mentioned one of the important anti-immigrant legislations, and the National Origins Act in 1924 is one of the kind of critical points. It almost completely cuts off any remaining Asian immigration to the United States, severely limits any European immigration to the United States, especially Eastern European immigration. So immigrants coming from Poland, from Greece, Southern Europe as well. Again, opening up then, whatever jobs are available are opened up to then people like Puerto Ricans who are American citizens. I think there's an important way to look at the great migration of African Americans to the industrial north, Chicago, Detroit, New York, Philadelphia, and so on, as facilitated by this National Origins Act that cuts off immigration elsewhere, opening up factory jobs for some groups. The immigration of Puerto Ricans to the U.S. is focused on New York City, especially up to the World War II, and especially then first couple decades after World War II. But you also see then after World War II increasing immigration of Puerto Ricans to places like Detroit, Chicago, and Lorain, Ohio, and Cleveland. So the Puerto Rican community in this area really has its roots in the late 1940s, early 1950s, as people are brought in to work in some of the factory jobs. Migration has slowed in the 1960s and 70s, and you see actually higher levels of return migration. But still, you have these vibrant communities that have their roots in this area, have their roots in the post-World War II era. Like Puerto Ricans, Cubans came to the United States before the Spanish-American War, largely merchants, some political exiles. The great Jose Marti, who was the kind of founder of the Cuban nation and the founder of the anti-Spanish political activity in the late 19th century, was one of these political exiles, and he was Cuban. So you have Cubans coming to the United States in some numbers in the 19th century and some numbers up to 1959. 1959, of course, is a critical point then in relation between Cuba and the United States and the Cuban Revolution. Between 1959 and 1977, More recent groups coming are Dominican Americans and Central Americans. You can see here some of the different numbers of those groups coming in the 1 million, nearing a million. The estimate then that Dominican Americans could be higher, could be as high as 1 to 2 million in 2000, probably even larger now. Most of them in the New York, New Jersey area. You know, someone like Juno Diaz, who wrote The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde, is one of those. Dominicans, comes from a Dominican American family, and he's from New Jersey. Central Americans largely then El Salvadorans, Guatemalans, Hondurans. Many of them, of course, fleeing then wars, some of the wars with deep involvement of the United States in those wars. I think Washington, D.C. is a good example of having large numbers of Central Americans. So Washington, one of the kind of largest Latino and Latina groups in Washington, D.C. are Central Americans. Any questions? Okay, so today what I wanted to end with just some of the challenges facing Latino and Latino historians who are interested in this past. One of the problems is that there tends to be within the United States a focus on black-white then relations, and so relations between Anglos, between whites and African Americans, and so then Latinos and Latinas often, as well as Asian Americans, often don't find a place within this kind of larger discussion of race. So race tends to be discussed in a binary form in the United States, and it becomes much more complex talking about it in terms of a Latino and Latina context, Asian American context as well. I think one good example is where to fit then people like Roberto Clemente, right, the great Puerto Rican baseball player. Where do Puerto Ricans and Cubans who played in the Negro Leagues, how would they fit then in terms of race relations in the United States? So historians have gone back and started to try to tease out then various racial hierarchies that don't just work within a black-white, let me say, binary. There are often just some very basic problems in terms of numbers. Most Mexicans, Puerto Ricans, Cubans, and so on were classified in U.S. Census as white during most of the U.S. Census. So anytime you want to find some of the numbers, how many Mexicans are in the United States in 1920, very, very hard to do because it's all classified as white. And so you have to tease it out by looking at census documents and looking at surnames in place of birth. There are some places to go. Newspapers are one example. Spanish language newspapers. La Opinión is one of the famous Los Angeles newspapers, and we have very good archives of some of these newspapers in the teens, 1920s, and so on. There are minutes of community groups, groups like LULAC, League of United Latin American Citizens, GI Forum, Young Lords is one of the prominent then Puerto Rican movement groups in the 1960s. We have some oral history collections as well as census records, which I talked about. We also have less commonly legal records, and so what you have in front of you here is a legal record from LexisNexis. I want to talk through that very quickly, and then I'll summarize and let you all go or ask questions if you'd like. So this is a case of Beneficio Tendilla. This is from Texas in 1929, right on the eve of repatriation. So you're starting a swelling then anti-immigrant, anti-Mexican immigrant feeling during this time period. Beneficio Tendilla, if you had a chance to look through that, is pulled over for an alcohol possession crime, again, during Prohibition still, right? And so then a police officer sees what looks like a bag in his back seat. The police officer says this is suspicious, goes and opens it, and it is indeed a bag of that contains then alcohol, a jug of alcohol. He's convicted, but rather than paying his fine or going to jail, he finds a lawyer then and appeals his conviction. So then he has enough of a sense of his own rights within the American legal system to say, I was unjustly convicted of this crime. We don't have a sense of him as being wealthy. We don't have a sense of him as being especially politically connected. He seems to be an ordinary Mexican man. He appeals the conviction, and then he actually wins, and his case is overturned. The judge, the higher court judge, sees that argues that there is no essentially probable cause, that it was just a sack in his back seat. It didn't have a sack that said liquor on it. It didn't have a sack that gave any other sense other than it just being a sack, and he was searched. So his case then is reversed. And it also engineers what I think is a remarkable statement during this period, and that's at the end of the second page there. And this is, again, the Supreme Court in Texas, or a higher court in Texas, a higher court judge writing, "Appellant appears to be only a humble citizen of the state, but he is entitled to the protection of the law in the preservation of his constitutional rights from invasion. From what he has said, it follows that we have concluded that the motion for rehearing should be granted, the affirmance set aside, and the judgment be now reversed and the Kyles remanded. That is, a new trial is then ordered. Likely he would have gotten off on this new trial, given that the court had already seen that that seizure of his bag was improper. So again, only a humble citizen of the state, he's entitled to reservation of the law and his constitutional rights from invasion. So a couple of things one thing I want to take from this is the sense of Mexicans, even during some of the most difficult period in the United States, as feeling to have a right to the American judicial system and being strong defenders of their rights. Okay, so let me just summarize real quick. Latinos have a long history in the United States, going back well, in some cases 60, 70 years before the first presence of English or French in the United States, and it extended then presence in the U.S. in the 19th century, Puerto Ricans, Cubans, in addition to Mexicans. So have a long history in this country. Despite some obstacles, we do have, as historians of the Latinos and Latinas, we do have some records at our disposal. We have a variety of newspaper records, census documents, organizational records, and so on. And we also have some legal cases. And so I think even going into the legal archives, we have then the presence of Mexicans making claims. And finally, then, ordinary Mexicans like Beneficio Tendia turned to the American judicial system with an expectation of justice and felt like they were entitled to their rights. And I think this is a long history of ordinary Mexicans being involved in various forms of civil rights, including the use of the American courts. That's it, and I'm happy to open it up for questions.
But my question is, do you expect your grandkids to speak Spanish?
You know, it's a good question because, so I'm mixed. My mom is Panamanian and my dad's Anglo. And so I grew up with an ear for Spanish and mijo and so those kind of things that, parents will say to their children. But I did grow up as a speaker. And so, but for me, I have a certain connection. I tell this to other students who, are of Latino background but then don't speak, that I have an intimacy with Spanish that I'll never have with French, that I'll never have with German, I'll never have with Italian, because that was the language of my parents and the language of my early childhood. So, I think people are kind of cycling back in a way. Like when I drive, I listen to books on tape in Spanish, and I have an okay ear for it, I can speak some. And with my kids, that Spanish is a language that if we want them to speak a second language, that's what we want them to speak. So if they want to watch extra TV, they can watch it as much TV as they want, but it has to be in Spanish. And so when they take language classes, they take Spanish classes. And when they take, a dance class, we found a Latin dance class, right? So I think I think people will maybe move away from Spanish, but I don't think they move fully away from Spanish. And so I think that there are kind of cyclical ways. So I anticipate maybe, I hope my kids will. I want to go to Panama and have them spend a couple weeks every summer there. So, yeah.
Well, I've heard so many people who say, oh, I wish my parents had spoken German or whatever the language is.
Absolutely.
And they didn't.
Yeah, it's a critical part of identity.
But those things should not prevent us from having official English as our, as our language, but go out of our way to help the people learn English.
I think that's great. And I think, Latino immigrants have been, have flooded then English language training programs. And in fact, they've run out of those because they want to learn English. I don't know. I think anytime you make something official, you start, that's the first step to making it disappear. And so I tend to think that, that you freeze it and then you make it static. And I just don't think languages grow in that way. And of course I love English, right? That's my language, right? But I want it to be able to be as diverse and mobile and dynamic as it can. And I think making it official really hampers it and really binds it in some unfortunate ways.
Are all the Spanish languages in the Caribbean and Central America, they're all from Spain?
Right.
But then what? Their indigenous peoples corrupted the purity to what it is now, and maybe that's not a good word.
Yeah.
Just like our American English has been corrupted by.
I would frame it differently, added wonderful nuance to it.
Pure Spanish.
Right. Yeah, I think so. But I think there are still some indigenous languages that folks have been speaking for hundreds of years, over 500 years, right? And that those of course are changing too. And I think it's important to think about indigenous communities as also being dynamic, as also shifting in some important ways. But I think one of the arguments of people speaking Spanish, and that's one of the tensions I think with Hispanic, is to kind of say, oh, well, the real Spanish is Castilian, you know, and you have the Barcelona, right? But the way Puerto Ricans talk, or the Cubans talk, or the way Panamanians talk is not real Spanish. And I think that there are really some, you know, tricky dynamics there, including racial dynamics as well, that these are not only in terms of indigenous, but in terms of African heritage as well. And so when folks claim Spanish heritage in New Mexico and so on, that's always a flag for me, is wondering, is that Spanish heritage or is that white heritage, right? Is that European heritage? And so, yeah, I think there's a lot of nuance and complexity.